915 Talk is a production of Desert Voice Media. You can visit desertvoice.media to learn more.
915 TALK.
The world is looking at El Paso.
What will we say to the world? From the KELP studio in El Paso, this is 915 Talk.
And now your host.
Good afternoon, beautiful citizens of the borderland. This is 915 Talk, and I am once again your host, Andy Frecka. Today we are broadcasting from the heart of the world's largest borderplex. We're here at the KELP studio in El Paso, and today we have the distinct privilege of having Mac Daddy Del Norte on the board. Mac Daddy, how you doing this afternoon?
I'm doing just fine, Andy. How about yourself?
I thought you'd never ask. I must confess that my vocabulary is painfully poverty-stricken. I'm unable to fully describe the wonder and joy that I experience each and every weekday afternoon as we learn to love our city, love our neighbors, and give God all the glory.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and normally we're focused on issues of the borderland, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, we get a lot of good guests talking about a lot of interesting things, but today we're going to go to the far corners of the earth.
Okay, where to?
Oh man, we're going to go on a whole geographical journey.
Oh man. All right.
We're going to go. Oh man, I'm not even going to give all the locations.
Okay.
But we're going to start off in Ukraine, go through Russia into Kazakhstan, Russia. I believe we'll go to the Philippines, maybe even Paraguay.
Wow.
Yeah,
Okay.
and it's not just a geographical journey; it's a story of God's faithfulness.
Nice. That's the best part.
Amen. So today we have a good friend.
Okay.
I'm always happy to introduce our audience to some of my old friends. As our audience knows, I was a missionary in Russia for many years. And I remember way back in the late 90s, I was just starting off in this ministry. It was small. It was very remote. And what I was looking for was probably just some friends, some people to come up and encourage, lift up my arms. And our guest today was one of those people.
Cool.
And, yeah. And he was extremely busy, had a lot of responsibilities. He was overseeing, I think, over 1,200 full-time missionaries.
Oh, wow. That's a lot of people.
Yeah, but he still found the time to come and visit us in remote Russia. So always grateful to him for not just being a mentor or, a teacher with a position, but being a really good friend. I can remember just sitting with him in our living room, watching silly videos, laughing together with our family. So
nice.
Super happy to introduce him today, but we're going to be hearing his story and his father's story of God's faithfulness through the years.
Okay.
So without further ado, let's give a very warm borderland welcome to the one, the only, Mr. Peter Iliyn. Pete, welcome to 915 Talk.
It's great. Sorry, I interjected myself so quickly there, and I wanted to say thank you so much. It's always good to hear from you, and always good to be with you. And in your introduction, you forgot to mention the great country of China. A good portion of my story takes place in China.
Right. Yeah, probably the biggest part of the story for sure.
Yes, that's right.
So yeah, it's I think a lot of our listeners are driving right now, so they can't pull out a map. But we do understand where Russia is, where the former Soviet Union, where China is. So Pete, I've heard this story, of course, several times before, but it never gets old. And really, it's the story of your father.
It is, Andy. Actually, I'm celebrating almost my 50th year in full-time missionary work with an organization, the one that you were working with for so many years, Youth with a Mission. People say, come on, Pete, is it youth? I say, hey, it's an attitude of heart. Come on. But it's 50 years now. And throughout that entire time, I tell people probably 90 to 95% of everything I've taught throughout those years as a missionary, I gleaned from my father. And that's really the story that I learned as a little child growing up. Should we jump into the story, or where should we go here, Andy?
Yeah. So, like you said, you are a missionary. You've been a missionary, full-time ministry for about 50 years. But as you're saying, it starts off with your dad. So tell us the story of your dad.
Well, I was actually not born in the United States. I was born in a country called Paraguay. in 1956. So if you're really good at your math, you know I'm only 50 years old. But anyway, moving on quicker here. I was the oldest son. I have an older sister, and another brother was born in Paraguay. And then we moved to San Francisco. And three more siblings, two more sisters, and a brother were born there. And Andy, we were quite poor at the time. My parents did not speak any English. They spoke, even though we're Ukrainian, my mother and father spoke Russian and Spanish because we were out of Paraguay, although we didn't speak the Paraguayan language, Guarani. And so we were quite poor. We actually didn't own a TV my entire childhood. As a matter of fact, all I did for my childhood activities, much of what I did for that was reading books. I read every Hardy Boys book I can get my hands on because, you don't have a TV. And the other thing that we did is we waited for Dad to come home from work. Mom and Dad, even though they didn't speak the English language, they worked any job that they could. They provided for us. We were poor, but, Andy, we never knew we were poor. My mom was an amazing cook. I think she was probably the best cook God ever created besides your mother. But she was an amazing cook. So we never knew we were poor. And my dad would come home. There would be three kids, four, eventually six of us. And my dad would always pray for us before we'd go to sleep. I remember that as a child. And he would always gather all three of us, four of us, eventually six. If you can imagine yourself living in San Francisco, and you think of San Francisco, what do you think of geographically? You think of the Golden Gate Bridge and cold wind blowing through the Golden Gate. So imagine yourself in a frigid, cold evening. Dad's about ready to pray for you, but he puts you on a nice, warm down comforter that my mom made for each of the kids. She eventually passed it on to each of us when we got married. But we're sitting there, and my daddy says, I want to pray for you, but before I pray, I want to share a story. Now, my dad was such a phenomenal storyteller. We would always say, Daddy, we can't wait. He didn't make up the stories, Andy. These were tiny little snippets of his own life story. And so out would come these stories, but he would only share a tiny little bit. And he would always leave us hanging. We're going, Daddy, tell us more. And he would say, tomorrow. And it's like, no, torture. We couldn't wait for tomorrow. So that's the way I grew up hearing these stories, Andy. I heard them so many times because my dad would just go over and over and over. More kids would be born. He would keep telling us. And literally, the stories became part of my DNA, and they literally changed my life.
Yeah. So here you are. You were born in Paraguay, but your family ended up moving to the States, to San Francisco, and your father's telling you the story, really where he came from.
That's right.
Right. So where does that story begin?
Well, let me just give you a little bit of background, and I was not privy to this when I was a child growing up. It'll just help you understand the story a little bit. But 1917, the revolution started. Many of your listeners may know some history. The Bolshevik Revolution started. Communism came in. And about 10 years after the revolution started, they began coming into, earlier, but they began coming into Ukraine. My grandparents were living in a tiny little village north of Odessa. Most people now should know where that is because of the present war that's going on.
Right.
And they were living in a tiny little village. They were Orthodox believers. They really didn't have a personal relationship with Jesus. It was more religious. And they were very poor. They owned a little farm, some animals. They never traveled very much. Tiny little village. My grandfather apparently accepted Jesus very quickly because his brother knew Jesus. He led him to Jesus very quickly. My grandmother wanted nothing to do with God. She ran off to her father's house. What do I do? She said, my husband joined these Christian, they call them Christian sectarians back then. How do I get him back to the original church? Her father said, I know what you need to do. They're really pious when they pray. They close their eyes, fold their hands when they fall on their knees. When he's at home, make sure the children are there because they need to see this. You need to humiliate him. Remember, they were farmers. And when he's praying, takes that pig slop that you have, a pail full of. When your husband has got his eyes closed, walk up behind him with the kids watching, pour that pig slop all over his body, humiliate him. He'll come right back to the church. You can imagine my grandmother did this to my grandfather for months. He was a brand new Christian. I think he eventually went back to the church and said, what do I do? This is what my wife is doing. And they said, Yaakov, or Jacob in Russian, you must have patience. I'm sure he said, like, how long? And so eventually one day he took off to a prayer meeting. And back in those days, Andy, they prayed, 3 to 4 hours. And so she runs off to her father's house. What do I do? What's wrong? Well, my husband hasn't come back to the church. Well, where is he? He's at some prayer meeting. Oh, I know what you need to do. Her father said, you go find the biggest stick you can carry. You go to that prayer meeting, and in front of all of his peers, you humiliate him. You beat him on the head. Now, Andy, I know people that were at that prayer meeting. Some of them were only 16 years old. One of them would become our pastor in San Francisco years later. Mm-hmm. So I heard the story from him. He wrote a little booklet. I did quite a bit of research when I was writing my book. And they said, we'll never forget, the door flies open and there's silhouetted in the door is your grandmother with a big old honking stick in her arms. We were stunned. We should have stopped her, but we didn't. We watched her walk right up to your grandfather. He was praying with his eyes closed. She raised that stick and we're going, no. And right before she clobbered him, he opened his eyes, looked up in her face and said, Pelageya, that was her name. What are you doing here? The stick falls out of her hand. She collapses on her knees, looks him in the eyes and says, Yaakov, I don't know what I'm doing here, but whatever you have, I desperately need. And 2 hours later, she came out filled with the Spirit and she gave her life to Jesus. That's how my grandmother became a Christian. And, yeah.
Wow. So again, your grandfather gave his life to Christ. The family had a religious background, but no relationship with the Lord.
Right.
He's praying. She's pouring pig slop over him.
That's right.
And then he's at church praying and she comes in and somehow the Spirit moves on her life when she sees her husband there. And
that's right.
Gives her life to the Lord.
That's right. So they're a brand new Christian. So they began doing a very dangerous thing. They began reading a book called the Bible. And God says a lot of interesting things in the Bible. One of the things he says is, talk to me. He says, pray, but it's the same thing. Talk to me, and I'll talk back to you. And Andy, God started talking to them. God chose a particular way, not because they were super religious, but just because God is God. And that's the way he chose to speak to them. He would give them a prophetic word. There would be an interpretation. And that's the way he spoke. And so God began speaking to my grandparents and said, I want you to sell everything. Well, they didn't have much. They were poor peasants. And God said, I'm going to lead you to a distant country. He didn't even say where. And so my grandfather starts selling everything in his tiny little village. Everybody there knew him. Yaakov, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? God told me to do it. Why? He says he's going to lead us to a distant country. Where? He didn't say, but he told us to tell you, you can come with us as well. And if you do, you'll avoid a huge disaster that's going to come on our village. Of course, nobody else came. A year after they left, the communists came and burnt the village down to the ground. So when they came out of that little village, they went east. They went east all the way around to the country of Georgia. That would be the country where Stalin was born. And in the city of Batumi, my father would be born. He had an older brother, sister, and he would be the fourth child born. From there, they headed straight east towards Baku, Azerbaijan, right by the Caspian Sea, around the Caspian Sea, right through Central Asia, right into Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, that area, right up against the Chinese border to a tiny little town called Jarkent. Today, if you look on the map, it's called Panfilov. That tiny little journey I just mentioned to you right now took 4.5 years.
Wow. Okay. So again, I want to make sure that we understand what you're saying. Your grandparents came to the Lord, and the Lord began to speak to them. I think that's something that it is a new concept even for a lot of people who have been in the church for a while. But the Lord begins to speak to them something that's radical: sell everything because you have to leave. And they did that, and they begin to leave. I'm reminded almost of Noah and the ark. What are you doing? You're building an ark for what?
Yes,
you know what's happening. Right. And Noah escaped the flood, and your grandparents escaped the communists who came down and burnt down their village. But they've now started on this epic journey, and you just in a couple minutes outlined the first 4.5 years. Russia to the nation of Georgia, onto Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and now they're on the border with China in Kazakhstan.
It's amazing, and they knew nobody in this. It's a tiny town called Jarkent. Well, and feel of today. But my grandfather knew nobody there. But when they came in, only Kazakhs and Uyghur people live there, which are Turkic or a Muslim people group. And they didn't know anybody, but they met some Ukrainians, and they began talking with them, and they began sharing the story. And the other Ukrainians said, "That's exactly what God said to us." And they formed a group of about 47 people. This would also be why I would know so much more of the story. I know I met many of the, well, not many, but the ones that were younger that would become like our leaders in our church in San Francisco. I met them over the years. And so they formed a group of about 47 people. They apparently rented a building. They would meet there for prayer time, for a worship time. Meanwhile, they would be working, waiting on God, waiting for God to speak. Remember, this is already, communism was progressing. And so they could not just kind of move around freely. They would have to have permission and whatnot. And so my father remembers one day his dad comes home from work, maybe a couple of months living in this little town. And he says, "Kids, tomorrow, God is going to lead us to a country where there's white bread and honey." My daddy had never eaten white bread before. He had only eaten black, coarse Russian bread. And he had never tasted honey, though he had heard of it, honey before. He couldn't imagine a country of white bread and honey. But his daddy said, "Don't tell anybody we're going, because if the police find out, they'll throw me into jail." So my dad remembers early in the morning, he was 4.5 years old. He and his siblings simply picked up what they could, left their house, and all the families made their way to this building. I forgot to mention that these Kazakh and Uyghur people were very entrepreneurial people. They would be on the streets from 2 in the morning, go to sleep, wake up at 6 in the morning, they'd be working. This building was located by a huge open air marketplace. So there were people around all the time. There were specially trained police roaming the streets with specially trained dogs, searching groups of men that were meeting together. Because obviously, if they were meeting together, they were trying to escape into China. Why China? Because China was relatively free. It was not communist. And so all the people were trying to escape into China. So the Soviets knew this. So they tried sealing the border with patrols and whatnot. And so these dogs would be roaming the streets looking for anybody meeting. So when all these people gathered together that day, they were not praying out loud. They were not singing out loud. They were trying to be very quiet. The kids are getting restless. It's the early afternoon, and they're praying, waiting on God. And Andy, God speaks prophetically. "Children, trust me. I'm going to lead you out tonight. And when I lead you out, I want you to walk through this town shouting praises to my name loudly." Have you ever had God say something to you and you're going, "There's no way, that's impossible." And you hear God speak back to you saying, "Amen. Impossible for you, not for me."
Yeah.
And God even said something like this prophetically: "Children, I'm going to lead you out by 1 in the morning." So there were people everywhere on the streets. And so suddenly at about 12 midnight, a huge thunderstorm and rainstorm hits that little town. Thunder, wind wrestling through the trees, thunder echoing through the air, and everybody disappears from the streets. Even the dogs disappear. And God speaks prophetically: "Children, now." And I'm told by people that were 16 years old, I talked to them. They said, "We flung the doors open. We walked outside, formed a single file line 2 blocks long. We walked through the middle of this town shouting praises to God's name. Nobody heard us except God as he thundered his approval."
Wow.
And when they came to the outskirts of the town, they could hear behind them the bell tolling 1 in the morning. And I mean, miraculously, God led them out. Once they got out, there were no signs that said China this way. So I don't know what you do when you need guidance, but they fell on their knees. They began seeking and praying to God. And God speaks to the elders, and they appoint some younger leaders to lead the group. And they all decide that we're going to travel at night. And during the daytimes, we're going to lie in these tall bulrush grasses so that the patrols on horseback wouldn't spot us. This was a desert area between that town and the Chinese border. Very cold at night, very hot during the daytime. My dad says at night we'd be trekking. If there was no moon up, we would not see anything. He says my mother had just given birth to my younger brother. He was a couple of months old. And every so often, the dirt road would just hit a fork in the road. We wouldn't know which way to turn, left or right. The elders would pray. They would say to the younger leaders, "God said turn left. God said turn right." Andy, that's how God led them through the desert. So one day they come to a fork in the road. They pray and God says turn left. And everybody looks left. and the road was horrible. And then they turned right and the road looked much better. And they did something I'm sure none of your listeners have ever done. They began to rationalize. Are you sure? Do you? Maybe that wasn't, God would never. And before you know it, the majority, not all of them, but the majority said, we're not obeying God. And they went right. And Andy, when they went the wrong way, many things happened. And my dad says we should have immediately known because somebody robbed us, but we kept going on. And then for 3 days and 3 nights during the journey, we ran out of water. And he said, remember, he's talking to us as kids. I'm 6 or 7 years old hearing this story. And he said, kids, I'll never forget the second night, the kids couldn't even walk anymore. There was no water. The desert, it was so hot during the daytime. Now it was cold. We're crying. We're asking our parents, there's no water. And then I'm walking next to my daddy and I'm looking at my mother is holding my little brother. He's 2 months old. His name was Vasya or Bill. And she's crying and she's got a wet rag at his mouth. And I look at my father and I say, Papa, why is Mama crying? And he goes, because your mama has no milk to give to your brother. And then he looks at his papa and says, but what's that little rag at Vasya's mouth, at my brother's mouth? And suddenly his father blurts this out and he starts sobbing and crying. He goes, the only liquid your mother has is her own urine. And he starts weeping and sobbing. And then within 2 hours, he sees his father taking his little brother, wrapping him in a blanket, digging a hole in the sand and burying him in the sand. Before my daddy turned 5, he saw one member of his family buried. He didn't understand death, so he didn't know why his daddy did that to his brother. Well, by the 3rd night, nobody could walk anymore. I mean, the older people they're staggering. And my daddy says, you know what, kids, I'll never forget. It was about 2 a.m, pitch dark. We all collapsed on our knees. We couldn't move anymore. And we all started crying. And I lifted up my 4-and-a-half-year-old arms and we cried out as loud as we could, Father, give us water or else we'll die. I don't know if any of your listeners have ever been in that situation where suddenly you desperately need God. You might not need physical water, but you need to hear his voice. You need direction. You need something from God. And you know, when God hears that desperate prayer, he answers that prayer. And God speaks to these people and says, enough prayer, get up off your knees, walk straight ahead of you. Remember, it was pitch dark. So many meters, stop, turn left, so many meters, stop, dig. My daddy said that the elders and all the young men started digging in the sand, and they dug a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet. You know what happens when you're digging close to water? The sand gets it's laden with water. They took that sand, put it into rags. You wring out the final drop of moisture on the faces of the children. They dug another foot and a half, and water gurgled out of the desert floor. Mm-hmm. And my daddy says he remembers doing this, running with all the other kids, plopping on that sand, lapping up sandy water. Eventually sand all settled and they all replenished their thirst. Before they left that place, they left a marker there. Anybody walking by this area needing water, drink from this well. But my daddy says to me, son, if you ever tell the story, please tell them the most important thing we did. We went back to that fork in the road where we made the wrong decision. Most people wonder, why is my life so full of mistakes? Go to that place, that first place where you did that mistake, and correct it. And they said, we went back to that fork in the road and we went the way God intended us to go. And eventually they came up to the Chinese border. Now, basically, there's more detail in the book. I don't have the time to tell you the whole story. But miraculously, they don't know how to get across the border. If one person could get across the border, the Chinese guards probably wouldn't do much. But for a group, they would take the men and throw them into jail. And they're praying and they're saying, God, what do we do? And they could see about 2 miles ahead. They could see the patrol booth. They could see the soldiers. They could even see the dogs. And God speaks to them prophetically again. Another reason why it's important for us to know the voice of God. And God says, children, trust me. Don't look to the right or to the left. Walk straight ahead of you. Don't avoid those guards. Walk straight at them. Andy, you need to make sure that that's God speaking. You know? And
walk straight at the Chinese guards.
That's exactly what he said. And they walked around them. The guards didn't hear them, see them. The dogs didn't smell them. People ask me, how did that happen? And all I can do, if you can see me now, I put my hands on my ear and the nose and my eyes, because angels have big fingers, and they closed those guards' ears and their eyes, and they came into China. And once they got into China, Andy, a couple of sad things happened because they desperately needed food. So my grandmother, along with 3 other ladies, took off to tiny little Chinese villages to buy food. And the group was waiting for them. And they made a plan. They were all going to rendezvous back. Well, three ladies came back. My grandmother never came back. And the leaders were praying. They felt like the Lord said, we need to move on further into China or else they'll send us back to Kazakhstan. My grandfather said, you can't move. My wife's not here. Yaakov, you got to have faith. We got to move on. And they moved on. My grandfather suddenly had a decision to make. What do I do? Well, he couldn't stay. He couldn't hang by himself. So he took his kids. My grandfather started weeping and sobbing. He was always a joyous man, but he grabbed his kids and he left without his grandmother. My kids said, we've never seen my father like this. I think my father probably knew because he started weeping and crying like, as if he knew he'd probably never see his wife again. And they got deeper into China. And they had a huge rice field. You know how they grow rice? They flood a field with water, waist-deep mud and rice and water. And they were trying to get out of the rice field before the sun came up because they don't want to be sent back to Kazakhstan. So all the young people, all the people ran out of the rice field. There was a huge ditch right by the road. They jumped into that ditch, but my grandfather was too weak. So they left him lying in the rice field. And if you were to read my book, if your listeners were to read it, my book starts with this location. Everybody's in this ditch. My father is 4.5 years old. He's overlooking the shimmering rice fields. He doesn't know where his mama is. He doesn't know where his papa is. And the first words in the book are, Papa, where are you? Have you ever asked God that question? Papa, where are you in this accident, in this tragedy, in this sickness? Papa, where are you? And he cries out, Papa, where are you? He looks at his brother Michael. Where's Papa? He goes, quiet. They'll hear us. He points out to the field. Can't you see that's Papa? That's his jet black hair. That's his jacket. My father focuses his 4.5-year-old eyes and he looks, he goes, that looks just like Papa. But then he thinks to himself, but why isn't he moving? Eventually, the sun comes up. Some of the local people there knew they were refugees. They said, hey, nobody's going to send you back. So two younger guys jumped out of the ditch to grab my grandfather, carried him from the rice field. My father and his brother jumped out of the hole trying to hug their father, but they noticed that he wasn't moving. And the first chapter in my book ends with these words. My uncle, my father's older brother, Michael, starts crying. My father looks at him and says, Michael, why are you crying? And he says, Papa is dead. To this day, we don't know how my grandfather died out in the rice field, if he was sick or if he died of a broken heart. But before my father turned 5, he saw the second member of his family put into a hole in the ground. Again, he doesn't know why they're doing this.
If you're just joining us, we're with my good friend, Pete Iliyn, friends for many years. He would come and visit me when I lived in Russia. He's a missionary leader for now 50 years, overseeing thousands and thousands of young people and maybe even some old ones who are full-time in missionary service, and so grateful for his friendship, but also he's sharing about his father's story. And that's outlined also in his book. The name of the book is Out of the Far Corners. If you go to desertvoice.media, go to that 915 talk link. You'll find our conversation with Pete. If you missed the first part of this, then you can go there and listen in podcast format. And we'll have a link there for Out of the Far Corners. The website, though, is outofthefarcorners.com, outofthefarcorners.com. Pete, you've been sharing with us really a story that's so powerful with God's faithfulness, about God speaking, but also there's tragedy mixed in. That's profound, painful tragedy. You're just sharing about how your dad lost his father, how he lost his brother. I've had the privilege of meeting both your father and his older brother, Michael. Michael is such a soft-hearted man, was such a soft-hearted man. It was a great privilege to have met both of them. But to go through all of this and come out with a soft heart is also a testimony to the grace of God. But you've been sharing about how your grandparents came to the Lord in what is present-day Ukraine, just a little bit north of Odessa. The Lord spoke to them to leave. They sold everything, left Ukraine, and sometime later, the communist authorities came in and burnt the village to the ground. They went on a 4.5-year trip from Ukraine to present-day nation of Georgia, to Azerbaijan, into Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. You shared the story of how God told them the exact time to leave Kazakhstan. And then as they were going through the desert, God spoke to them very clearly about a fork in the road, and they went the wrong way.
Right.
They went down the road that made the most sense, and encountered both tragedy and God's faithfulness there. From there, they went into China, got close somehow, the eyes of those Chinese border guards, and as you've said several times throughout, Pete, it's you've heard these stories not only from your father, but from some of the people who were young at the time when this all happened. They were teenagers. What years are we talking?
We're talking 1933 was when the journey really began, because my dad was born in 28. So my dad would be 4.5 years old. He was about 1933. So it would be in the 30s. It would be it would be that time frame. Andy, you recapped the story very well. The listeners have to remember, part of the reason I'm even sharing the story is we all have our stories to share. Now, they may not be as dramatic as my father's, but your listeners need to understand how this impacted not only my life, but all of my siblings. Because we were little kids when we were hearing this story. My encouragement to your listeners is share your story. Share your stories. Because oftentimes when you pass away, or your earlier generations pass away, the stories are gone. And that's why we need to pass on these stories. So just to kind of catch up, start up where we ended, because my father had just seen his own father put into the ground, into that hole. He didn't understand what that was again. But then he doesn't know where his mommy is. So the group kind of made their way a little bit north. If you were to look on the map, in China, northwestern China, in the Xinjiang province, there's a city it used to be called Kuljia, Kuldja, but today it's called Yining, Yining, Yining. And it's in the Xinjiang province. So they kind of made their way to that city. It was a big city, over 100,000 people. My grandmother, meanwhile, she had gotten stuck. She'd been trying to find bread. She finally found it. The ladies were supposed to rendezvous at a place. She came to that rendezvous. Nobody came back. So she then came back to the group. They were gone. She panicked. She didn't know what to do. She thought they were heading in this direction. She began going that direction. There was a river she tried crossing. She almost drowned. Somebody grabbed her and saved her life. She almost drowned in this fast-moving river. And a mosquito had bitten her, a mosquito laden with malaria. So she was very sick with malaria. And one of the local people, I think it was a Slavic, I can't remember that. I don't know who the names of the person, but they took my grandmother in and they nursed her back to health. It took them 3 weeks. And then they told her, she said, I want to find my kids. And they said, well, we hear that there's a bunch of Slavic people, Ukrainians and Russians in this city called Kuljia. So they brought her to this city, over 100,000 people. And Andy, she found her kids. I mean, that alone is a miracle.
Oh, wow.
And so she was so thrilled when she found her kids. But then, of course, when she found her kids, she found out the truth, that her husband had passed away. And Andy, my grandmother was very, very ill with malaria. Apparently, my father and his brother both got malaria as well, but their little bodies were younger and they could fight it. My grandmother could barely fight it. She ended up being sick with malaria in her bed for 6 months. Now, please, listeners, remember, I'm 6 years old hearing the story the first time. I remember my daddy telling us kids, I was 5 years old now, and it was my responsibility and my brother's responsibility, who was not even 13, to feed the family. And we're going, what, Daddy? How are you going to feed you're 5 years old. How are you going to feed the family? And my daddy said, kids, I know this is hard for you to understand, but my brother taught me some Kazakh words and Uyghur. Even though we were in China, there were no Chinese basically living in the city. They were all Kazakhs. They were all Uyghur people. And so I learned some Kazakh words, basically, please give me bread. And my father died and my mother's sick. He goes, for 6 months, children, even though I had malaria, my brother and I would be standing on the dirt roads in downtown, because when I say downtown, please understand it was just a very poor area. And I'd thrust out my hands and I'd beg for food for 6 months. Now, Andy, I have never had to beg for food. And we never, even though we were poor, we never begged for food. So we couldn't imagine having to beg for food. My father said many times, we'd say, please, my father's dead, my mother's sick, please give us bread. And they would give us bread. And that's what we would give to our mother and feed our 2 sisters. He said many times we'd get this funny looking bread. It would have this green hair all over it. We would eat it because that's all we had. And we would have terrible tummy aches because it was molded bread. Sometimes they would give us a crusty old piece of bread, and a dog would run by, grab it out of our hands, and we'd go chasing that dog, screaming and yelling until it would drop it into the dirt. We'd knock the dirt off and eat it because that's all we had. Many times I'd knock on people's doors, please, my daddy's dead, my mommy's sick, please give us bread. He goes, that's how we fed my mother and my 2 sisters. He goes, kids, I'll never forget standing next to my mother's very sick bedside. My brother was off trying to find bread, and I heard my mother's final words. She said, children, how can I leave you like this? She closed her eyes and she died. And and he said, at that point, they took me and one of my sisters, put us in the wagon in the front, and in the back of the wagon was a rickety old box, and my mother was in that box. And they took me again out to that dreaded field, and I saw the hole in the field, and suddenly I understood. And I began to scream and yell, don't put my mommy in that hole. And I remember my daddy telling us when we were little kids, I didn't want them to put my mommy into that hole. I wanted to jump into that hole with my mommy. Now, Andy, my daddy's story actually starts right here. All that I shared prior to this was the lead up to his story, because the story of my dad is a story of a little 5-year-old orphan boy living in a very strange country called China.
Wow. Yeah, it's Pete, it's so interesting again, to be reminded that we follow after Christ, and he is so faithful, and that doesn't necessarily mean that life is going to be easy.
Yeah.
And I think of your father in this situation, and yet somehow in this, we'll never probably understand this side of glory, all that happened, why it happened, just like, much of what happens throughout our lives. But you think about what was happening back in Ukraine at this time. This is the 1930s. It's Joseph Stalin in charge in Moscow.
That's right.
They probably would have all died for sure back in Ukraine. And so God was delivering them. And I hear the heart of your grandmother there. How can I leave you kids this way?
Yeah.
But somehow, as we continue on in the story, I know there's some very difficult parts, but somehow Jesus is there. So here's your father, 5 years old, a Ukrainian orphan in China.
Yeah, his older siblings were quickly snatched up by other families. There were all the families that were very poor, and they snatched them up because they could work. But my father was simply an extra mouth to feed, Andy. And the pastor would stand up in the service at the church. They had a church, service there in that city in China. And he would say, please, at the end of the service, you guys all remember Yaakov and Pelageya. That was my father's parents. You all remember them. Would somebody please take 5-year-old Vanya? Nobody did. Now, Andy, I can't judge them. They were all poor. They all made it to China with a bunch of children, and nobody would raise their hands. And so the interesting part of the story is this. Remember, I did an enormous amount of research when I started writing my book. I traveled all over the world. I have hundreds of hours of research. And I talked to my dad over and over again about his story. But before I wrote the book, I was sitting with my uncle, Misha. I was sitting with him at a table. We were celebrating his 66th wedding anniversary. And my father was sitting with me. My uncle became like a father to my dad when their father died. My uncle absolutely loved my daddy his entire life. He was 7 years older than my dad. And so he literally became like his father. And so my uncle loved my dad. And so he begins telling me this story. And my daddy's sitting there listening as well. And I'm stunned. I'm going, Dad, I never heard this story. And my dad looks at me and he goes, son, I forgot it. It was a part of his life that only took 2 weeks out of his life when he was 5 years old and he had forgotten. So I'm going to share the story with you here. But remember, my siblings never heard this part of the story until they read my book. And it was amazing. So my uncle starts telling me the story. He says, we were taken by another family. And a couple of weeks later, I came back to the church looking for my little brother. And I asked the pastor, where's my little brother? Well, apparently what had happened, and the pastor tells him the story. He says, well, we kept asking people. Nobody would take him at the end of the service. But one service, this gentleman walks up to me. I had never met him before. And he says, you don't know me. We're new to the church. We're a good family. We don't have any children, and we'll be happy to take Vanya. Well, the pastor should have vetted him, should have found out a bit more about who he was.
Where's Child Protective Services?
I know it, and they were brand new Christians. They never did that. And he gladly gives my 5-year-old dad to this man. Well, 2 weeks later, my uncle is there looking for his little brother. By now, the pastor knows who this guy is, and he's kind of embarrassed. He's going, well, your brother's living with his family. Well, my uncle goes, well, who are they? Well, we just found out that they're illegal bootleggers. Okay. They're making illegal whiskey. And my uncle is telling me the story. And I'm sitting there going, what? Dad, you were living with illegal bootleggers? And my dad is going, I remember now, son. I totally forgot this part of the story. So I said, Uncle, what happened? He goes, I'm stunned. I'm weeping. My brother is living with a bunch of alcoholics. Where is this house? And so this pastor is trying to backpedal, and he says, well, they live here and this is where the house is. Well, in what part of the house does my brother live? And he told them everything. So my uncle tells me, I'm running to this house and I get there late at night and sure enough, there's a window. I knock on the window and my dad goes, I remember this. There I look in the window, there's my brother. And I'm excited. My brother's telling me, quiet, don't yell. And so he says, open the window. My dad says, I open the window. My uncle says, I reached into there and I grabbed my brother and I kidnapped him and I ran away with my brother. And I'm going, cool story, Daddy. And my dad is going, yes. Matter of fact, he goes, I remember when they brought me to this house, there was a funny smell in the house because they were making whiskey. They were making it. My job apparently was to collect all of the pears. They had a huge pear orchard and the ripe pears would fall to the ground. And my job was to collect these ripe pears and they would make whiskey out of the ripe pears. Apparently you can make it out of any fruit that's got some sugar in it. And he said, they even offered the whiskey to me. Fortunately, I didn't drink any, but he said the people were they had big red noses and they were always laughing. They're a bunch of alcoholics. And I'm going, Dad, this is an incredible story. So my uncle says, I kidnapped my brother. I brought him back to the pastor's house. And right as they walk into the house, there's another gentleman. This gentleman, along with his wife, had come out with this group. They'd never had their own children. God used them. They were the leaders of the group. Ivan Verkhovodov was his name. But they had since moved. They were living about 150 kilometers away in a farm. And his wife found out that there are orphans in the big city church. So she tells her husband 5 days earlier, go to the big city church and find me a little orphan girl. Well, it takes him 5 days in his horse and his wagon to make it his way to this pastor's house. So as he's arriving, my uncle's carrying in my little dad at the time, his little brother, my father. And he asked the pastor, I hear you have orphans. Yeah, we do. Great. We'd like a little orphan girl. She's my wife wants her to help her on the farm. So the pastor says, sorry, we don't have any little girls. But as my uncle comes in, he goes, well, actually, the only one we have is this 5-year-old boy, Vanya. Well, you know how men are. He looked at my 5-year-old dad and thought to himself, boy, girl, I'll take him. And so the pastor tells him, would you like maybe leave tonight? Because when that family finds out he's been kidnapped, they're not going to be happy. So my father says goodbye to his brother, not knowing if he's going to ever see him again, gets on his horse and wagon. And Andy, for the next 5 days and 5 nights, he's traveling to a new home, to a new city. He starts talking to this man and referring to him as Papa. My dad is 5 years old, and he can't wait to meet his new mama. And as they approach their house, he sees this lady coming out of the house, and he thinks to himself, that must be my mama, my new mama. And then he thinks to himself, but something must have gone wrong. Why is she so angry looking? And as they get out of the wagon, they walk up. This lady, her name was Masha. She looks at her husband, and then stares at my father, 5 years old, and in front of my father yells these words to her husband. I thought I told you to bring me a little girl. Why did you bring me this little dog? Look at him. He's a mutt. He'll be a mutt for the rest of his life. First words he heard coming out of his new mother's mouth were he's a dog. And my father says he lived. Remember, I'm 6 years old hearing this story. And my dad says, I lived with Masha for 4.5 years. And I'm being very kind to your listeners when I say there were 4.5 years of hell on earth.
So here we are in the story where your father has come on this incredible journey across the former Soviet Union. He's gone into China. He's lost his brother. Now he's lost his parents.
No,
he's an orphan.
Yes, a little brother, right?
Yeah. He's lost his parents, and nobody wants him.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's, we can definitely, we can't be judgmental of that. We don't know what it was like for these families. They were all, I'm sure, at the end of their rope, in many ways. And so no one's taking him. And so he's taken in by some bootleggers there in China. Right. What a wild story. But he's looking for a home in all of this. He's never really had a home in his whole life. And here he is, he's being taken into what he thinks is his future mom, who calls him a dog. And you say, these next 5 years of his life were really hell on earth.
They were, Andy. I'm being very kind. Now, again, your listeners have to remember the setting when I heard the story. It's so important. I'm a little boy with my siblings sitting on that down comforter. And our daddy tells us just a tiny little bit of the story, and we're stunned. My daddy says, Masha never fed me properly. They lived on a farm. They would have milk. I would reach for a glass of milk. She would knock it out of my hands, give me the leftover after she made butter or cream, which is just like white water. I'd reach over to try to grab some butter. She would knock it out of my hands. Her husband would always say, Masha, why are you treating him like that? And she just didn't like my dad because he was a little boy. She was a Christian lady, Andy. She did give my father a chore. She lived on a little farm, so she had a barn in the backyard, and she raised chickens, mainly for the eggs. And she would go and check out the chickens late at night and tell my father, tomorrow morning you should find 15 eggs. And his job was always to wake up early in the morning, collect the eggs, 15, 17, 13, however many eggs she told him. And my dad said many times I'd walk into the barn, I'd collect, she said 15 eggs, I'd find 12. I'd scour the barn. I'd look everywhere. Who knows where the eggs went? Because the chickens kind of laid them haphazardly all over the place. And he would walk into the house, the back of the house, and she'd count the eggs. She'd start screaming and yelling, you lost 3 eggs. He'd try to explain. She'd force him on his knees, pull out a leather strap from the corner, from the pantry, and beat him viciously for not finding 15 eggs. Now, Andy, I'm 6 years old when this is going on. We're stunned. We're going, Daddy, this is not right. It was not your fault. You didn't lose those eggs. I mean, we were ready to do anything. Now, when my daddy was telling us, the story, my dad thought that Masha was still alive, because many of these people that immigrated through China, many of them would immigrate to a variety of places in the world. Many went to Australia. And so my dad thought she was living in Australia during the telling of the story. We later on found out she died in China, but we didn't know that. So I still remember, Andy, we were little kids. We said, Daddy, this is not right. You tell us where she lives. We get on the next airplane, go to Australia, karate chop her to death, blow her house up. I mean, we were ready to kill this lady. Now, listen, your listeners need to hear this, because all my daddy needed to have said at that point was, that's right, kids. Masha was a horrible lady, and I hated her. And he'd have planted seeds of bitterness into our tender virgin hearts, and we'd have grown up hating a lady we would have never seen. And Andy, I'm glad to tell you and your listeners that my daddy did not do that. My daddy would start sobbing and weeping, and he would say to us, kids, don't think evil of Masha. I know she mistreated me, but at least she was willing to take care of a little orphan boy. And if I was to meet her again, remember, he thought she was still alive. If I was to meet her again, I'd run up to her, I'd give her a huge hug, and I'd thank her because at least she was willing to take care of a little orphan boy.
Mm. Wow. Yeah, I think that's important to again underline. Here you are listening to your father's story, hearing how he's being unjustly beaten by a really a hateful woman. It sounds like to me, and he's not planting those seeds of bitterness in your hearts as a child. A good reminder for us as parents, to always be careful what we're sharing with our children, how we share it. And your father didn't candy coat the story, but he also was careful to express gratitude. That's so powerful. So you were there on the bed listening to these little snippets of the story with your father about his story, again, coming from a Christian family that escaped the Soviet Union, went into China, went through incredible tragedy, losing his parents, all of these things. And what did you say would happen at the end of each evening?
Well, Daddy would stop. He would literally, like I just told you this story, and we would say, Daddy, tell us more. And he would always look at us and say, tomorrow.
Right. Okay. So that's the perfect cue, because we're coming to the end of our broadcast for today, and we're going to continue this story tomorrow. We're with my good friend, Pete Iliyn, longtime missionary, good friend. Pete, I often think of those times back in Perm, Russia. We would sit there and watch those silly videos in the evening and just laugh and laugh. And
I loved your kids. Loved your kids.
Yeah, they're all grown up now, but but such good memories. Appreciate your friendship over the years, but I also believe your father's story. It's so foreign. A 5-year-old Ukrainian in China before it became communist. But we get so many lessons out of it that are important for us today. So you put those all into a book called Out of the Far Corners. Out of the Far Corners, an epic tale of rejection, grace, and deliverance by Peter Iliyn. The forward is by someone who I think is a familiar voice to many of our listeners. It's by Johnny Erickson Tada. But you can go to outofthefarcorners.com to order that book and learn more. And we're going to hear the rest of the story, as they say, tomorrow as we continue to learn about Peter's dad, Vanya. Where does he go from Masha's house in China? We were with my good friend, Pete Iliyn. He's sharing the story of his father, who came out of Ukraine in the 1930s when it was part of the Soviet Union, escaped with his family together with a large group of Christians who carefully followed the voice of God. And they were led from Ukraine to Georgia, the country of Georgia, to Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and into China. And along the way, Pete's father lost his little brother and both of his parents. And so, as we were saying yesterday, it is a story of tragedy, but also the faithfulness of the Lord. And as we went through this story, we heard how he became an orphan and he was sent to a family where they were incredibly unkind to him. But he was careful, as he was telling his kids the story, not to sow seeds of bitterness in their hearts. So without further ado, welcome my friend back, Pete Iliyn. Pete, let's continue the story. This is Out of the Far Corners. This is in your book, Out of the Far Corners. What happened with your dad, Vanya, after these years of being in a house where he's being beaten, unjustly treated, and I would assume he remembers some of the faith of his parents, and maybe he's praying.
Oh, he is. He is. He remembers it very, very well. And it's good to be with you again. This happened at the beginning of his time with Masha. And again, I'm telling your listeners, one of the most important things I could say is please don't plant seeds of bitterness into the tender virgin hearts of your children, your grandchildren. Very, very important. We grew up and we thanked our dad for not doing that. And so I remember asking my dad, Daddy, what did you do after Masha would beat you unjustly? And then she would let you get up off your knees. He would say to us kids, I'd run out of the house and I'd run back into the barn. And I had my own little place there. We call it his little altar. He said, I'd fall on my knees and I'd raise my hands and I'd start talking to God. And I remember saying to my dad, Daddy, why don't you get bitter at God? Why don't you get bitter at Masha? I know a lot of people that have gone through a lot less than what you have, and they hate God to this day. And my dad would say to us kids, why would I get bitter at Jesus? Jesus was my best friend. Jesus was my father. And a lot of people ask me, how did your father handle such pain? And all I could say is, from a little childhood, he allowed Jesus to become his father. And that's that's my encouragement to your listeners. It's not something that anybody else can do, but get to know God as your father, not just as a distant being somewhere up in heaven. My dad said one day he was coming out of the barn. She said 17 eggs, he found 14. He's already weeping, anticipating a beating. He walks out and he sees a neighbor lady standing on the other side of the fence, and she's just staring at him, watching him. And then she beckons him over with her finger, kind of calling him over. He comes over and she says, why are you crying? Well, I'm supposed to find 17 eggs. I found 14. She's going to beat me. Yeah, I hear how she beat you. It's not right. You stand right here. I'll be right back. She ran into her own barn, found her own 3 eggs, and came and gave them to my daddy.
Yeah,
and she said, don't tell.
Yeah, I think it's important just to remember we're talking about people who are struggling financially, to say the least.
Right.
Giving
That's
3
right.
eggs to a neighbor boy is an
That's right.
enormous sacrifice.
It's a big sacrifice.
Right.
But the amazing thing, Andy, is she said, don't tell Masha I did it. I just don't want her to beat you. And in the course of 4.5 years, she did it so many times that she literally became his savior. He would come out of that barn, scouring the fence line, hoping against hope he would just see this neighbor lady, because if he saw her, he wouldn't get beaten. And you know what I like to tell young people nowadays? I think sometimes we overcomplicate missions. Sometimes I think God says to us, simply go give somebody a glass of cold water in my name. And when you do a kind thing, in the name of Jesus, nobody else knows you did it. One day God will honor you and bless you for it. If you don't believe me, listen to this story. Years later, my wife and I would get married. We would have a daughter, Lana, and we're traveling to Australia. Luba lived in Australia. She was actually born in China. This is a whole nother part of the story. We'd have to have another radio program for Luba's story. But her parents immigrated to Australia. And so we're traveling in Australia, speaking in a bunch of churches, getting ready to go to do a huge outreach in Russia during the Olympic Games. And
1980.
1980. And actually, we're going to be actually, we're preparing for another game. So we're recruiting people for the LA games. But anyway, so we're we're in Australia. And an elderly couple invited us home for a cup of tea. Andy, I don't know who they are. It's just that while we're drinking tea, she tells me they lived in Australia. Australia? I said, well, let me tell you my daddy's story. And God speaks to me and says, tell her the story about the neighborly lady who gave your daddy the eggs. And when I told her that story, this lady has a tear in her eye. And she says to me, Peter, I was that lady. And I jumped up, I grabbed her, I hugged her. I said, thank you for caring for my daddy when nobody else cared for my dad, and you gave him those eggs. When I came home and I told my daddy that story, he started sobbing. What's the probability that I'd go to Australia and meet this lady? It's almost as if God was involved. And a couple of years later, my daddy was a pastor at the time. This lady sends her son to America to meet my dad. My dad stands up in front of the church, honoring him. This is the son of the lady that gave me eggs when I was 5 years old. Listen to me. When you do a kind thing in the name of Jesus, nobody knows you did it, but one day God knows you did it. He will honor you for doing it. You know, my dad formed strange friends during his time with Masha. His closest friends became dark corners. That's why I even titled my book Out of the Far Corners. Some people say, why did you call it Out of the Far? Well, it's a double speak, because the corners became his closest friends. Because when he was sitting in a dark corner, that's when he talked to his best friend, Jesus, and that's when nobody would beat him. And it's also out of the far corners, meaning out of the far corners of the earth. Literally, the story took place out of the far corners. But they became my father's closest friends. So my father would live with Masha for 4.5 years. She never loved him. She never sent him to school. He was 9.5, almost 10 years old when she and her husband wanted to go to the big city. They didn't want to take my dad. So they took their 5 or 6 head of cattle. They took my dad now to Masha's sister's house. She had a big ranch. She had a bunch of children. She said, let Vanya stay with you. He can take care of my cattle and your 40 head of cattle. So for the next 6 months, Andy, my father's living with another family. He cannot call them mom and papa. That's Masha's sister and husband. They have a bunch of children. My father never even meets the children. You know why? Because his job was to take care of the cattle. He'd wake up at 4, 5, 6 in the morning, herd 50 some odd head of cattle, 20 kilometers, find a place where they could graze. After they graze, eat the chew the cud. He'd bring them late back at night, about 11 o'clock at night. The kids were all sleeping. She'd feed them. He'd go to sleep, wake up, and do it again for 6 months. 6 months. And he would tell us kids, when I'm out and the cows are eating, they're chewing the cud, there would be nobody around for miles. I would just be out there by myself, very hot during the daytime. And we would say, well, what would you do, Dad? He would say, after I would eat, then Masha, of course, gave him food. I mean, the Masha's sister. While they're doing this, he says, I would pray. But I would not just pray quietly. I yelled my prayer as loud as I could. And here's the way I prayed, kids. I said, dear God, please deliver me from these cursed cows. I hate these cows. And then he says, I would just pour my heart out to Jesus. Now, I would ask you listeners, do you think that God hears the prayers of little orphan boys deep in China? Aren't you grateful that we have a God that hears those prayers? Nobody else heard those prayers except God and, maybe the cows. But God answered those prayers. 6 months later, he's coming home late at night, and everybody's sleeping except the lady. And she's getting ready the food, and she's sitting at the table, and she's crying. And my daddy looks at her and says, why are you crying? Anticipating that he must have done something. And this lady says, Vanya, I've been praying, and God told me tonight, that we're supposed to release you from this responsibility. You've got to go to the big city. You've got to go to school. You've got to do something. Otherwise, this is all you'll be doing for the rest of your life. But my husband doesn't want to let you go because you're a good worker. So you must be persistent. You must be persistent in saying this. And so my father insists, because her husband is not wanting to let him go at all. And so he insists and persists, and finally he lets him go. And they find a shepherd that's taking a bunch of sheep to the big city. And they ask him, take Vanya with you. Here's where Masha lives. So for the next 2 or 3 weeks, he's walking behind bleeding sheep. And unbeknownst to them, Masha's husband had just died. So she's in a real bad mood. Can you imagine a worse mood than she'd already been in? And the shepherd knocks on the door, and she sees my dad. What are you doing here? And the shepherd explains, and she grabs him by the ear, pulls him in the house. A couple of days later, literally by the ear, pulls him back to the same church that had given him to her husband some 5 years earlier. At the end of the service, Andy, she stands up. My dad is now 10 years old. And in front of this packed church, she says, 5 years ago, my husband came here looking for a little orphan girl. You gave us this orphan boy. He's been with us for almost 5 years. He's been nothing but trouble. You can have him back. Can you imagine that being said about you publicly?
Wow.
And finally, another couple raised their hands, and they said to the pastor, we have no children of our own. We'll be happy to take Vanya in. So my dad now is finally free of Masha, and now he has a whole nother family to live with.
Wow. Okay. So, wow. If you're just joining us with my good friend Pete Iliyn, he's sharing the story of his father, who escaped communist Soviet Union, went into China, lost his parents when he was 4.5 years old. And the past 5 years, he's been living with this lady, Masha. Then it was her sister.
Yes.
And her sister, they're basically, I mean, looking at this, at least through my understanding of life, they're using your dad for child labor. Really? Yes. They're beating him if he doesn't get enough eggs out of the barn, but the neighbor lady's being kind and giving him some eggs. Then he's walking miles and miles with 40 cows. Can you imagine a 7 or 8 year old in China who doesn't even speak the language? He's herding these cows, and he's there by himself, truly by himself, just raising his hands and shouting that God, get me out of this job. And not to be flippant, but I'm thinking of how many people are praying. Maybe they're listening right now, praying that God would release them from whatever job they're in, and maybe God would answer that prayer just like He did for your dad. But also, this does bring a little perspective. Probably no matter how bad our jobs are, or can feel at times, it's still not as bad as being a 7-year-old herding 50 cows through China. So
that's right.
And at the end, 5 years of this, he doesn't receive a thank you, nothing. He's taken to the church again, and they stand up and say he's been nothing but trouble. Wow. So we'll continue the story. Again, we're with Peter Iliyn, my good friend. The book of his father's life is Out of the Far Corners, an epic tale of rejection, grace, and deliverance. The foreword is by Johnny Erickson Tada. The website is outofthefarcorners.com. Also, I will mention, if you turn on the radio today and you're like, well, where did this all begin? Well, you should have listened to the radio yesterday, because we talked about the first part of the story yesterday. Quite a story. If you missed that, you can go to desertvoice.media. That's the website, desertvoice.media. Click on that 915 Talk link, and you'll be able to listen to the recording from yesterday, or watch on the YouTube channel, which is 915 Talk. We do need to go into a break. Do not touch that dial.
We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial.
915 Talk is listener supported and is a production of Desert Voice Media. That's right. It's people just like you who make this program possible. Together with Desert Voice, you can learn how to better serve our neighbors and pray for our community. To become a Desert Voice Media partner, you can visit desertvoice.media. That's right. That's the website, desertvoice.media. Take a look and join us today in reaching our borderland for Christ.
Breaking worldwide news. You can now feed your mind, feed your soul with great Christian teaching and talk on Alexa. That's right. All you have to say is, "Hey Alexa, play KELP radio," and boom! Instant Christian teaching, talk, and truth 24/7.
As a business owner or CEO, you carry a lot: big decisions, heavy responsibilities, and often no one to process it with. That's why C12 exists. C12 is a confidential peer advisory group for Christian business leaders who want to build great businesses for a greater purpose. It's not networking, and it's not a class. It's a room of leaders committed to excellence, accountability, and purpose. If that sounds like what you've been missing, learn more at c12borderplex.com.
This is Pastor Steve Castrita. I'd like to extend the invitation for you to join us in service every Saturday at 5 p.m. at Redeeming Grace Church, El Paso. We are located at 2400 George Dieter inside Iglesia Philadelphia. We're a young church on the east side of El Paso with no smoke, no lasers, and no gimmicks, just the uncompromising Word of God and a call to win the 915 for Jesus Christ. We'd love to meet you and your family. God bless you, and thank you for listening to KELP.
We're back. You're listening to 915 Talk.
You are listening to 915 Talk. I'm your host, Andy Frecka. Today we're with my good friend, Pete Iliyn. He's a longtime worker with Youth with a Mission. What a lifetime of service. Pete, how many countries have you been to?
No, not that many, about 100.
About 100. Well, it looks like you have your work cut out for you.
Yes.
About 100 left, or how about?
It's been a wonderful 50 years serving as a missionary, that's for sure.
Right. And I know that as you share your father's story, as you said at the beginning of our broadcast yesterday, really your father's story is a big part of the foundation in your life as you've had this lifetime of service. So we're listening to the story of your father coming out of, again, Soviet Ukraine. He's there in China. He's finally released, I'll say, from the grips of this lady, Masha. He's back at the church, and a family takes him in.
Yes, his family ends up, they had no children of their own. There was a father, a husband and wife, and the wife's mother lived with them. She would become my father's grandmother, and life totally changed. They were very nice to him, kind, and for the first year or so, everything seems to be going very well. The father, my daddy couldn't call them Papa and Mama anymore. In the Russian tradition, in that case, you call them Jaja and Chocha, or uncle and aunt. Yeah, he just couldn't say Mama and Papa anymore. You can imagine just the hardships that he's already gone through. And so apparently he was he repaired sewing machines. Back in those days, Andy, a sewing machine was very important. And if your sewing machine breaks, you're in trouble. So he would travel to little villages repairing sewing machines. I think that's why probably they took my father, hoping that they'd be able to pass this on to him. So there would be many times they would be gone for 2 to 3 weeks at a time, and my father would be home with grandma. I'm going to share just a few funny stories here, just to lighten up the story a little bit, because my father's life is so full of tragedy. But my father shares a couple of funny stories. One of them was one day he's well, this is not necessarily a funny story, but it's an interesting one. One of the jobs that they gave him was to collect firewood. And he said in those days, we would have to travel with my grandmother on the buggy and a horse and wagon. We'd travel for 10, 15 kilometers, and I'd find old bushes that would be dead. I'd dig up the roots, and I'd pile the roots up on the wagon, and we'd use the dried roots as firewood. One day I was completely done of piling up the roots on the wagon. There was nobody around us, just me and my grandmother. And suddenly I hear a blood-curdling scream. And I run around to the wagon, and there's my grandmother in the ground, having fallen down, and she's holding a wrist that's been broken and twisted. And so now she stands up, she looks at me. Remember, he's like 10, 11 years old. And she says, Vanya, you have to straighten out my broken wrist. He takes that broken wrist and you can imagine she is screaming bloody murder. So now my father's got a big problem in his hand. How do you get grandma on top of those roots? You're not going to dump all the roots. That's an all day's worth of work. So he grabs it. He comes up with an 11-year-old plan. He has a rope. He ties it around his grandma's waist, throws it over the roots, over the wagon, runs to the other side, starts pulling at it. Grandma, make your way up. Somehow with one good hand, she inches her way up and makes her way up on top of the roots. So now they're sitting there. He's about ready to take off with the horse. And suddenly he realizes, unstable. My grandmother's got a broken wrist. She might fall, so I better do something. So he comes up with another 11-year-old plan. He takes that rope, ties it around his waist. The other end he ties rather solidly around her neck. And so they come driving into the house, and I'm sure the father saw his mother-in-law's neck in the noose and screamed out loud. So fortunately she never fell, so it just ended up being a funny story. But anyway, another time they were gone, the father and mother are gone, and dad is home. My father's home just with grandma, and he's sleeping, and suddenly at about 2 a.m, somebody is just screaming and yelling and waking him up. He thinks he's having a nightmare. He opens his eyes, and an inch from his nose is his grandmother's nose, and she's screaming at him, get up, do something, he's going to kill us. My dad is sleeping. He wakes up, he's 11 years old, and he doesn't know what's going on. And he can hear somebody banging on the back of the door of the house. And she goes, Vanya, do something. He looks out the window. He sees a huge robber. They used to call them shibinse. These robbers, if they broke into your house, they not only robbed you, but they killed anybody in the house. So basically, my dad is dead along with his grandmother. And she's yelling at him, tell him to leave. I think he was not even 11. He was only 10. And so my dad is thinking, now, how do I say get out of here in his language? Because he doesn't even speak their language. So he figures it out, and he yells as loud as a 10-year-old kid can yell, get out of here. Like, oh, yeah, that's going to work. And my dad tells us as kids, that guy suddenly stopped. He turned white like he had seen a ghost, and he turned and ran for his life. And he says, me and my grandmother, we were stunned. We were hugging each other. We were crying. We were sobbing with happiness. We were sliding down the wall, sitting on the floor, just happy. We're alive. And the next day, they told some friends what happened. And they said, well, what did you tell him? He said, I just told him get out of here in his language. They said, no, repeat it. Exactly the words you used. So he did. And they said, no, that's not get out of here in his language. You yelled, may God curse you in his language. Now, I don't know if my dad's 10-year-old voice said, may God curse you, if that would have frightened him. But I think maybe God modulated his voice and he came out sounding like Schwarzenegger. I think that's what happened. And that's how God spared his life. But anyway, that's kind of a couple of funny stories there.
Yeah,
But so
I love all this, Pete, because it's such a life of being aware that God is near. And
yes.
as you're telling this story, I'm reminded of the one story that I have with your uncle. So it'd be your dad's older brother,
Right.
and I'm driving him through Russia up to this prison village. You've been there
Yes.
before,
Yes.
and on the way, it was so interesting for me, and I found it to be a bit amusing. But every time I would tell them, "Oh, there's a police checkpoint ahead," or this or that, they would both, your uncle Misha and your aunt Nadia
And
would begin just praying.
tightening up.
Yeah, and praying and praying and praying so passionately. But it was just that was the life that they knew, and
Yes.
it's really the life that we should know. As
Yes.
as we go through all situations in our life, just knowing that we're there in it with God, and we can always cry out to Him.
Yes. So here he is. That's kind of funny stories, but everything seems to be going well. And then about a year and a half into his time with his family, the lady calls him in one day and says, Vanya, I want you to take these green bell peppers that I grew, really nice looking fresh bell peppers. Go to the farmer's market, lay out this on the ground, sell them for this much money. Here's a quarter or whatnot for lunch. When you come home, this is how much money you should have. So my dad has never done this. He's selling these green peppers. They're really selling well because they're beautiful green, huge bell peppers. And he's all excited until he turns around and realizes about half of them had been stolen while he was talking to people. He's stunned. What do I do? He doesn't even eat. He throws the money she gave him for the lunch in the till. At the end of the day, he has maybe 2/3 of what he should have. What should I do? I'll tell her the truth. She doesn't believe him. So when he comes home, he tells her, she yells and screams and kicks him out of the house and says, never come back. And my dad said, kids, I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where my brother was, my sisters. I ran out of the house. There was a grove of apple trees. I fell under the apple tree. I didn't even care if anybody heard me anymore. And I was just crying out as loud as I could. And here's the way I prayed. I said, God, I don't know what to do. Just take me home. Just take me home. I want to see Jesus. I want to see my mommy and daddy. And he said, suddenly I feel teardrops on my shoulder. And I opened my eyes and there's my grandmother. And she said, Vanya, don't cry. I'll try to convince my daughter to take you back. So she explains to her daughter the whole story. And she reluctantly takes my dad back. So my dad is now living with them for another year. So now he's a little bit older than 12. And they call him into the room and they say to him, we've been praying and we feel like God wants us to officially adopt you. Now, Andy, I've never been an orphan, but I've heard when you're an orphan and somebody wants to officially become your mommy and daddy, that's a big thing.
Sure.
And so they said, before we adopt you, we want to take you to the big city. Your brother and your uncle want to see you. They hadn't seen him in about 5 years. And then plus the man says, when we adopt you officially, I'm going to buy you a gift. I'm going to buy you a brand new pair of shoes. My daddy had never had a brand new pair of shoes. He couldn't imagine a new pair of shoes. So my daddy says they jumped on the wagon and they're coming into the big city. And from about a mile away or so, a kilometer away, he sees his brother walking towards him with his uncle. My father jumped out of that wagon and ran into the ensuing arms of his brother. And out came his whole life story. He poured out his entire story to his brother and finally ended up with, and these people want to adopt me. And he wants his brother to be happy, but his brother's not. He's going, Misha, why aren't you happy for me? And Misha says, because our uncle and aunt, this is our father's brother, they have no kids of their own. Their life has changed. They could finally take us in and raise us as a family, and we'll all be living together. Yeah, but they're going to be my real mommy and daddy. Yeah, but he says, suppose they kick you out of the house like they did a year ago. Where will you go? And my dad said, I thought long and hard and decided I want to live with my uncle and aunt. Then he said, when I told this couple that I don't want to be adopted by them, they got vehemently angry with me, he said. They began yelling and screaming, we've been so kind to you, and this is the way you treat us. And as they were driving away from my father, the man turns around and lifts up a pair of new shoes. And he says, I bought these for my son, but I don't have a son to give them to. And my dad said to us, even as kids, I thought maybe I had made a mistake. But apparently it didn't end up as a mistake, because for the first time, he's now living with an uncle and aunt, and he's living with his family.
Wow. Okay. All right. So he was 4.5 years old when he got to China. He was with Masha for 5 years. And how long was he with this family?
He's with them for about 2.5 years.
Okay, 2.5 years. Okay, so now he's with his brother Michael
His
or Misha.
sister.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, and his aunt and uncle. All right, where does the
Yes.
story go from here?
Well, he's finally living with family, Andy, and family care about family. Other
Mhm.
people, I can't judge them, but they just didn't care as much. So they finally sent him to school. The first time he was 13 years old when he went to school the first time. But it was not a normal school. They sent him to an apprenticeship program, a 3-year apprenticeship program. So by the age of 16, my father graduates as a professional cobbler. Now, your adult listeners know what that is. When I share it with young people, they don't know what a cobbler is.
Yeah.
So my father would make shoes. You would walk into the store, they would measure your foot, they'd cut out the leather, and they'd make your shoes. Take them a couple of months, and they'd finish your shoes. So by the age of 16, my father's a professional cobbler.
Okay,
Now,
hold on. So he's 13 years old, Ukrainian boy in China going to
Yes.
trade school to become a cobbler.
Yes.
You can't make this stuff up. And also, before we continue, I just want to say cobbler is one of my favorite words in Russian. Sapochnik.
Sapochnik. That's exactly what it is.
It's a great word. So he's a cobbler. He's learned how to make shoes in China. Life is looking up. He's 16 years old. He could start
16 years old.
Shoes.
And his mentor was a Chinese cobbler. He told me his name. It's in the book. But he's the one who taught my dad. And I grew up in the shoe business my whole life because my dad loved shoes. Anyway, that's a whole other story. So my dad is now a professional cobbler at the age of 16. Now, even though this is China, Andy, the Soviets were starting revolutions. They would find this people group, and they would ensure that they hate this people group, and they would start a revolution. And so they started a revolution there in this northwestern part of China. And they were taking 12-year-old Russian boys, giving them rifles and sending them to the front to fight in this war. My dad was 16. They grabbed my dad right off the street and threw him into the army. Now, my dad, remember, I'm 6 years old, hearing the story for the first time. My dad said, "Kids, I told my commander, listen, I'll do whatever you want. I'll make boots for you. You can't fight a war without boots, but it's against my faith to kill people. I can't do it." And they forced me. They said, "You must take a weapon." He goes, "I can't. I can't do it. You must. I can't. You must. I can't." So then they said, we're going to make an example of your insubordination. So they took my 16-year-old father, blindfolded him, and put him in front of a firing squad. Now, please, listeners, remember, I'm 6 years old. We're stunned. We're going, "What? Daddy? They were going to kill you?" I still remember this. I remember saying, "Daddy, what were the last thoughts that flitted through your 16-year-old brain, knowing within a second there'd be a bullet there and you'd be dead?" I'll never forget my daddy's answer. He said, "Kids, I couldn't wait for the bullet. I wanted to go home. I wanted to see Jesus. I wanted to see my mommy and daddy." I remember as a kid thinking to myself, there's got to be something about this God. My daddy was not even afraid to die about him.
Yeah. And even, again, I want to say, even through this, such tragedy, such loneliness, he was still hanging on to his faith tightly. And so he definitely knew Christ through all of it. And here he is in front of a firing squad in China. And what happened next?
It's incredible because as my dad is telling the story, and after he told us the story, I remember thinking to myself as a little boy, thinking, "Oh my God, I wonder what would have happened to me had my daddy died."
Right, of course.
Of course, my daddy doesn't die. Another officer comes up. This guy says, "Listen, we'll get into trouble if we shoot him. So instead, let me make out his orders and send them to the front without a weapon." Well, that's just like being shot in the head. So the next morning, my dad has his orders, and he's supposed to leave to the front. When another officer comes, this guy's in charge of the factory that makes boots. You can't fight a war without boots. So he tells this other officer, "I need a good man to help make me boots." Well, this guy says, "Half of my guys are cobblers. Take any of them you want." This officer looks at all the men and points at my father and says, "I want him." You know what? They had a huge argument, and guess who won? My daddy never even stood guard with a weapon in his hands. He literally, he made shoes throughout his entire time in the army. If somebody were to buy my book, and it would be signed by me, I always put Psalm 68, verse 5 in there that says, God is a father to the fatherless, because he literally became my father's father. Right. And helped him get out of the army, because he served for 1.5 years and he came out of the army without having even served once on the front lines. While he was in the army, he had a pain in his stomach, Andy. He didn't know what it was. He thought maybe it was kind of a gastrical issue or something, a little bit more towards the right side, but he didn't know what it was. So now he's living with his uncle and aunt out of the army, living with his uncle and aunt, and they are praying, and God speaks to them. Now we're talking around 1948. Okay. They're praying, and God speaks to my uncle, 46, speaks to them and says, I'm going to lead you out of China. Now, they're way up in the northwestern part of China. I have no time to tell the whole story. It's in the book, but they make their way all the way across China to Shanghai. My father and one of his sisters is with him. His other siblings are already married. They're living their own life in China. They eventually make their way over later. So they make their way all the way to Shanghai. And in Shanghai, they find a UN-sponsored ship that takes them down to the Philippine Islands. If anybody looks on the map, in the Philippine Islands, in the southern part, there's a big island called Samar. And a little part of the island is called Tubabao. Well, apparently there was a huge U.S. military base there with tents able to house about 5,000 soldiers. And the first refugees that would come there, including my father and his sister and his uncle and aunt, they helped erect a city that would hold eventually 6 to 7 or more thousand refugees. And that would be where my father would live for the next couple of months.
Okay, so if you're just joining us, keep on listening, because this is quite the story. We're with my good friend Pete Iliyn. Privileged to have known him for, since last century, since the last millennium. Yes. So grateful for the friendship, but the story of his father is one that needs to be heard. And the book is Out of the Far Corners by Peter Iliyn, an epic tale of rejection, grace, and deliverance, forward by Johnny Erickson Tata. The website to order the book is outofthefarcorners.com. And if you've been tracking so far, since we're now in the second segment of this program, Vanya has gone from Ukraine to Georgia, the nation of Georgia, to Azerbaijan, to Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, China, and now he's on to the Philippines. And we're going to find out what happens next, but first we need to take a break. Do not touch that dial.
We'll be right back. Don't touch that dial.
This is Pastor Steve Castrita. I'd like to extend the invitation for you to join us in service every Saturday at 5 p.m. at Redeeming Grace Church, El Paso. We are located at 2400 George Dieter inside Iglesia Philadelphia. We're a young church on the east side of El Paso with no smoke, no lasers, and no gimmicks, just the uncompromising Word of God and a call to win the 915 for Jesus Christ. We'd love to meet you and your family. God bless you, and thank you for listening to KELP.
Have you ever wondered what it might be like to connect your Sunday faith with your Monday work? Hi, my name is Tiffany Etterling, and I'm the host of a brand new program right here on KELP called the 323 Podcast. Colossians 3:23 says, whatever you do, do it as unto the Lord. Through stories and conversations with business leaders and difference makers, the 323 Podcast equips listeners to honor God in the way they lead, create, and serve. Because in everything we do, our work can reflect the one we serve. Join me each and every Saturday morning at 10 a.m. for the 323 Podcast, right here on KELP Radio.
915.
Testify.
I used to be a very angry person at the world, being young, having kids, having a wife, being a father, just meeting those expectations that the world puts on you. It's not about the world, it's about, your relationship with God. And I didn't realize that until I was older, and because I was living a life that I shouldn't have been living a sinful life, living for the flesh instead of living for God. I was hanging around people I probably shouldn't have hung around with, drinking, going out to parties, and coming home like 2, 3 in the morning. There was one day that that I completely broke down. My son was asking me like, Dad, how come you're like this? How come you're always mad? And yeah, that day I did end up bringing out my Bible. I just broke down and started crying, you know, because I felt the way Paul felt. Read your Bible, guys. If you don't know what to read, go into Proverbs, go into Psalms. God, he's protected me in so many different ways. He's the reason why I'm here. I'm trying to help other people reach God. He could truly change your life. My name is Miguel Ipave. I'm from El Paso. And if Jesus did this for me, I know he could definitely do it for you.
And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb
And by the word of their testimony.
desertvoice.media.
We're back. You're listening to 915 Talk.
And we're back. You are listening to 915 Talk. I'm your host, Andy Frecka. And 915 Talk is normally talk about the 915, but occasionally it is good for us to hear these testimonies. One of the regular segments on this radio station is 915 Testify. We do need to hear these testimonies because we will overcome by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of our testimony. And today and yesterday, we've been joined by my good friend, Pete Iliyn, sharing the story of his father. Out of the Far Corners is the book. But there are so many parallels to our life today, even with this crazy, crazy story involving eggs and cows and roots and a cobbler and a firing squad. And now your dad, Vanya, Pete, is on his way to the Philippines.
Yes, he arrives in the Philippines, and they helped erect this tent city. Now, again, they could Google this and Tubabao, the U.S. military base that was there. There were so many refugees from all over the world, and many of them were Slavs. And whatever this was in my father's stomach erupted. Now, please remember that I'm like, the first time I heard this story, I was like 6, 7 years old. And my daddy is trying to explain to us the pain. He said, kids, the pain, I can't even explain it. The pain was beyond pain. I felt like the insides of my body were wanting to explode. My sister took me to the nurse station there in this place where we were living, and the nurses looked and said, "Oh, this is way beyond us. You've got to take him to the next island, to the big city hospital." So my aunt would tell me she would rent a Jeep with a driver, and my daddy said, "Yeah, I remember that trip. It was horrible. I felt every hole, every pothole in the road as we were driving to this hospital." And I arrived at the hospital. So this would be now at the end of the Second World War in the Philippines.
Right.
He said they brought me to the hospital. They just wheeled me into the hospital, and he sees this doctor just covering up a patient. In other words, somebody just died. And he walks over and he does a cursory exam. And my dad is saying, "Kids, I can't go to the bathroom. I can't relieve myself." So this something inside of me is wanting to literally explode out of the inside out. The doctor does a cursory exam and looks at my aunt, my father's sister, and says to her, "Who do you think I am, God? Your brother is just as good as dead. His appendix is ruptured from within, and that poison is spreading throughout his whole body." That was that feeling of trying to explode out from the inside. The doctor said, "Nobody's going to help him. I cannot help him. It's way beyond that. There's a little room here, a tiny room. Let him wheel him into that room and let him die in peace." So my aunt starts weeping as she's wheeling my father. My father says to her, "Iliyn," that was her name, Helen. "Iliyn, I don't know what the doctor said, but I feel like I'm hours away from death." And she wanted to stay with my dad all night, and he insisted, "No, go back to the camp, find every Christian, every young person that believes in Jesus, and get them to pray for me." My aunt would tell me years later, she found 300 young people, Baptist, Pentecostal, Orthodox, and they all started praying for my daddy, Andy. They prayed for him all night. My daddy says, "Kids, the nurses would be rushing in. They'd be giving me penicillin. They gave me all these different shots. They gave me a bedpan. I couldn't use it. I couldn't relieve myself." At about 2 a.m, they stopped coming in because they realized they were wasting their penicillin. They left me all alone to die. And he said, "I felt like I had maybe 5 minutes left when suddenly I felt a presence in the room. It's almost as if like a bolt of lightning hit me in my head, and this energy went flowing through my body, into my fingertips, into my toes. And literally I felt a presence, and I didn't see anybody in the room, but I knew who that presence was. I'd felt it before." And he said, "Kids, I had this strong urge to relieve myself. I sat on the stool they gave me, and every ounce of that poison came rushing out of my system. That was not supposed to happen. every ounce of it came out. And he said, I was lying as though I was on a bed of clouds, absolutely no pain. God had given me a brand new body. The next morning, the doctor came up. He apparently, he looked at me and he says, John, what are you doing? You're supposed to be dead. And my dad only knew 4 words in English. And he said, Doctor, God healed me. And my dad said that doctor raised his arms like this for the longest time, that stood there and said, I don't know what happened here. This was not me. This must have been God.
Wow. Okay. So I love this so much. And here he is in the Philippines, and you would think that's the end of the story, where he's just going to die in this hospital after living through this life of just tragedy and hardship and such testing. And somehow he convinces his sister to go back to this UN camp. And I think some of our listeners can even visualize what that would be like in post-war Philippines. They go back and they find anyone who confesses to believe in Christ there in that UN camp. And here are these youth in the camp just praying all night for your dad. And there in the middle of the night, this miracle happens.
Yeah, it's quite amazing, because once God touched them and healed them, eventually they would leave this camp. I have a picture in the back of my book. The amazing thing for me, Andy, was I was able to give this book to my dad before he died. Probably one of the greatest achievements for me. And one of the greatest endorsements I've ever heard about my book came from my dad. My dad said to me, son, you did not exaggerate at all. You wrote only what I told you. That to me was wonderful. And I have pictures in the back here of these ships. And I'm sorry, I just showed it to you very, very quickly, because I showed it to my dad. And my dad said, that's the picture, that is the ship that I took. And my dad said, where did you get that picture? I said, Dad, there's something called the internet. And so they took a ship, and they took it from the Philippines, went around Australia, over to Sri Lanka, over into the Red Sea, up into the Mediterranean, hit a storm, almost split the ship in half, came over to Rome, took a train through Rome up to Geneva, took another ship from there through the Rock of Gibraltar down to Brazil, took an airplane and landed in an open field in Paraguay. Now you understand why I say out of the far corners.
Right.
And it would be in Paraguay that my father would meet this beautiful girl that would become my mother, and he would marry her in Paraguay. Out of the far corners.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We I think can often find our identity in the place that we live. And here's your father who never had a place to call home. Really all those years, from being sent from one family to the next, to ending up in a UN refugee camp, to ending up in Paraguay. And I think there must be some kind of lesson there about where our identity comes from.
Yes, we're getting close here to wrap things up here, but when I was a little child, I was born in South America, and then we eventually came to America when I was 2.5 years old, and there eventually would be 2 more brothers and 3 more sisters, 6 of us. So we grew up hearing this story, Andy, little kids. And this is why I encourage your listeners, please share your story. Your story, they're never going to be the same. So don't compare stories. Just share your story with your kids and your grandkids. But I remember as a kid, I never did anything really bad as a child, growing up. You know why? Because I fell in love with 2 people. Number one, I fell in love with God. I remember saying to myself, whoever this God is, my daddy was ready to die for him. And I liked this God because he took care of my daddy. And I fell in love with God as a kid. And then I fell in love with my daddy. And I never did anything bad because I didn't want to bring any more pain to my father's life. He had had so much pain as a child, I didn't want to bring any more pain. Today, I wonder if that's not the kind of relationship God wants us to have with him. He doesn't want us to serve him because we're afraid of hell or we want to go to heaven. He wants us to serve him because we fall in love with him. And so I would eventually finish high school And then I would go on to do my studies at university. I would tell young people nowadays, I studied at a very conservative theological institution called UC Berkeley. Nowadays, most young people do not laugh because they don't know that it was not a conservative theological institution. UC Berkeley is one of the most liberal universities in the country. But I studied electrical material science engineering. So I graduated with a double major in 1976. Annie, the reason I'm saying this is you can only imagine how proud my daddy was when I flipped my tassel. And then when I came to my daddy, and I said to him, Daddy, God has called me to become a missionary, not an engineer. And I want to work for an organization called Youth with a Mission. My daddy looked at me and said, son, I'm proud of you. I'm praying for you. But what's your starting salary? And I said, Daddy, I think I have to pay them. Well, my daddy did not understand. So for the first year and a half of my now 50-year career in YWAM, I started working in Los Angeles with YWAM. I'd come home every 3 months. And every 3 months, I would have the same conversation with my daddy. Today, I understand exactly what he was saying to me. He just didn't want me to be poor. He wanted, because my dad was poor his whole life. Finally, his son has an education. My dad was not a dummy, but he didn't have an education because nobody gave it to him. So his son finally has an education. Every 3 months I'd come home and he would say to me, son, I'm proud of you. I'm praying for you, but when are you going to become an engineer? Every 3 months. This went on for a year and a half. Finally, a year and a half later, I come home, same conversation. And my dad finally said to me, son, I can't live like this. I'm sorry. He says, let's go pray. He says, I need to find out from God why I don't have this peace with what you're doing. So I'll never forget that prayer meeting. I went to a little room with my father, my mother, and we collapsed on our knees. For 30 minutes, my dad wept out loud. I heard his prayer, weeping. Dad, God, what is the problem? Why don't I have a peace with what my son is doing? Please explain it to me. Tell me. I'm not going to get up off my knees till you speak to me. And I heard my dad agonizing. And when he got up off his knees, he looked at me. His eyes were like laser beams. And he said, son, I know the problem. God has spoken to me. The reason I don't have a peace with what you're doing is because I, your father, have not been willing to let you go. And then he said those magical words to me, Andy. He said, son, I release you and I bless you to pursue the very call that God has placed in your life. I tell people I felt like a little canary stuck in a cage, and my dad opened that cage door and he said, son, fly. And that canary eventually became an eagle. When I turned 40, my wife gave me a huge party, had about 150 people there. My mom and dad were there. My dad never ended up speaking English till the day he died. He spoke a little bit of English. My mom would speak it much better. So at the end of the party, my dad stands up and he's speaking to me, and I'm translating everything from Russian into English, trying very hard not to cry, at which I was not very successful. So here's what he says to me. He says, son, you remind me of Joshua. You're fighting the enemy in the valley face to face with your sword, and you're fighting the enemy face to face. And he said, and I promise you, as long as I and your mother are alive, I promise to you that I will be your Moses, standing upon the mountain with my arms raised, praying and believing God for your victory.
Wow. And having that kind of foundation has taken you around the world many times, Pete. And as you travel, you're sharing this story again and again because there's so many lessons in it. Yeah, and there's so many lessons in this. What are we have several minutes left. What are some of the lessons that you would just like to challenge our listeners with?
I think probably the most important one, Andy, thanks for asking. I would like to ask your audience, if those that have heard the story now the whole time, my father's life had a life message. Maybe you could hear the life message in the story. If not, let me put it this way, because every one of you has a life message as well. But listen to this. If there was anybody that I've met over these past, I'm now 72 years old, that should have been bitter their entire life, it would have been my dad. But he was one of the most gracious people you would have ever met. Well, listen to what his life story was. We, as a family, would always have big family meetings. My mother was an incredible cook, so we would always have gatherings, large gatherings, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. people would be invited to our house. My mom would cook, and the smell would permeate the whole house. We would not usually eat till about 2 p.m. So we're all famished and hungry, especially with all of our children. So our parents, grandkids were there. And it would be time to eat, but my dad would never let us eat until he would give his speech. And his speech would always be exactly the same, not because he had nothing else to say. He was a preacher, but because it was his life message. Every time we would eat, here's his life message. Here's what he would say. He would start off saying, "Children, I'm so grateful that God allowed me to meet your mother. My father absolutely adored my mother. He called her his little dove. My father could go on talking about our mother for hours. And we would say, 'Dad, we're hungry.' Oh, okay. He would finally go off. And then he would say, 'I'm so grateful to God that he allowed me to come to America.' He absolutely loved America because they opened the doors for these refugees to come and make a life. And then he would say, 'And I'm so grateful to God that he gave me,' and he names all 6 kids. 'And I'm so grateful to God for all of your spouses. And I'm so great.' He can't name all of our children, all 20 of them, but I'm so grateful for all of your kids." And then he says, "And I want you to know that I'm praying for every one of you and your children to be with me and your mother in heaven. But I'm not just praying for you and your children. I'm praying for your children's 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 children." My father's life message was one word, and it's called gratefulness. And I speak to your audience. What is your life message? Your life could have been full of pain. Listen, we live in a world full of pain. The reason that there's so much pain in this world is very simple, for a simple reason. We call it sin, but it's not just sin, it's selfishness. Selfishness says, "I'm God. And if I'm God, you're not God. So if I happen to be drunk and I drive into you and kill you, so what? I'm God." That's why there's so much pain, Andy. And when people go through pain, will they get bitter or will they get better? The only difference between those two words is one letter. If you focus on I, bitter, you'll always become, if you focus on yourself, you become bitter. If you focus on E, better, on Jesus, Emmanuel, you'll become better. Those are the incredible lessons I think you can learn from this story.
Yeah, that's wow. So many lessons. Again, the book is Out of the Far Corners by Peter Iliyn, forward by Johnny Erickson Tata. It can be ordered at Out of the Far Corners, outofthefarcorners.com. I know there's a lot of details in the book that didn't make it to our short 2-part series, Pete, but encourage everyone out there to get their hands on this book. This story, as I mentioned yesterday, is one that I've heard maybe even dozens of times, but it never gets old. I appreciate, Pete, that you've taken on really maybe even the responsibility of sharing this story with the world.
Yeah, I have. And because there is a message there, Andy, and I want the message to come out. My daddy would never have expected that this book would have been written, but with God's grace, it was done. So let it bring joy to other people's lives.
Yeah, Pete, it was so good to see you these past 2 days. So enjoyed spending this time with you. Thank you.
You're very welcome, Andy. Love what you're doing, and and thank you for allowing me to come and share with your audience.
Of course. And as we always say, let's learn to love our city and love our neighbors, and let's be grateful for everything we have, especially after hearing this story. And let's, in all of this, give God all the glory. This has been 915 Talk. You have been listening to 915 Talk, a production of Desert Voice Media. To listen to this or any previous edition of 915 Talk, just visit desertvoice.media and click on the 915 Talk link. Let's continue to learn to love our city, love our neighbors, and give God all the glory.